17. To the time I farted on a first date, Laura said. She was trying to get a game of I'd Go Back started, but Ivy said nothing, and Martine couldn't think of a single sweet or funny or outrageous example. Marty, got anything? No, she said, but inside she started listing. I'd go back to before Kate brought those chairs. She couldn't stand the feel of the thick plastic against her skin, and the squeaking shredded her last nerve. So now she was alone on the pile of cardboard, looking over at Laura on one and Ivy sitting on another with her feet on the third, the one that should be Martine's if she could bear to touch it. They were both worried about the state of Ivy's legs. Her ankles had been swollen for weeks, but they were dark red and shiny now, and when she took her shoes off, the marks lasted for hours. Keep them above your heart, Laura told her. Scooch right down. You'd be best to lie on the floor and put your legs on the seat, really. Ivy wriggled down, and Martine had to dig her nails into her thighs not to scream at the screech of the plastic. I'd go back, she told herself, to crying on the school bus, getting stood up, getting sacked for no reason, and them daring her to question it. I'd go back to the worst time of my whole life, she thought, to those endless days of raw early grief. She'd learned then why raw was just the right word. She felt flayed, as though she'd been scrubbed of the top layer of her skin. The wind was too cold, and the lightest breeze would set her shivering. The sun baked her, even in its springtime weakness. Her clothes irritated her, cotton scraping and wool like barbs, so that she checked every night for blood as she undressed. If she'd had a father, she remembered thinking, lying in the dark one night in the long, bleak trough of time after the funeral was past, the cards taken down, the flowers wilted. If she'd had a father, she wouldn't have felt this way. This couldn't be how human beings were meant to feel when an old woman died. The trouble was, she wasn't properly formed. She should have had a father and a real mother. That was the reason she was floored by the death of her gran. But she also remembered telling this to a Samaritan one night down the phone. It was early hours, with the sky changing colour and sleep as far off as ever. She explained it to the woman with the kind voice, about how she stayed at her mum's as long as she could, hoping to hear something, asking all the right questions. Then she'd go back to her gran for rest and clean clothes. But she'd never heard his name, and so when her gran died, she wasn't a fully formed person rolling with the blows like she should be. Instead, she was flattened by it, flayed by it. She felt as if she walked around under a personal spotlight, exposed. Or as if she had a sword sticking out of her chest through her clothes. A sword that no one mentioned and no one looked at, until their silence and averted eyes made her think she was going to scream. It's only natural, the Samaritan said. No, said Martine. It's because of my dad. If I had my dad, I wouldn't be in this state. The pain you're in, the Samaritan said, is the bill you pay for the love you got. Martine repeated the words, like a little tune played with 2 fingers on a toy piano, but they didn't make any more sense for all her going over them. If I'd ever had a father, she began again. The Samaritan interrupted her. She told Martine all about grief counselling and support groups. She advised a trip to the doctor, as if that could help, and suggested a new hobby and some exercise out in the fresh air. I thought you'd just listen, Martine said. Aren't you supposed to just listen? The woman had the grace to laugh, an awkward little laugh. "Within reason," she said, "but if you were hitting yourself over the head with a frying pan, I'd tell you stop." Martine thanked her, said she'd think it over, and hung up. She was smiling. She saw herself in the mirror opposite her bed, smiling at a stranger on the phone who wouldn't even listen to her. After that, she waited it out, because everyone said time healed all ills. They were right. When a year had passed, her skin got all its layers back, and she could walk along a street and stay as anonymous as a hippo in Dumfries could ever be. No spotlight shining on her, no sword sticking out of her, and no endless crawling questions about why everyone she passed pretended they couldn't see it. But it wasn't time that did it. It was podcasts. It was puzzles playing in her ear, teaching her that anything she could make sense out of, she could cope with. Anything understandable was bearable. It was the senseless that was terrifying. Martine let her head fall forward. Believing she'd work this out was the only thing keeping her sane now. She shouldn't mind whatever the other two used to help them, even if Laura's fantasies about someone coming made Martine want to scream, and Ivy's death wish made every day harder. "I'd go back," she said out loud, "to cross-country in PE. "I'm glad you said that," Ivy piped up, "because I've been thinking." She paused, as if to get their attention, as if there was anything else vying for it. Martine dug her nails into her thighs again. "We should all exercise," Ivy said. "We can see well enough. We should be walking 20 minutes, several times a day, fast enough to get puffed out." "You've changed your tune," Martine said. "Yes," said Ivy. "I realised I shouldn't be letting the two of you rule the roost." She paused and then said, "Mother knows best." Another pause. "Just kidding. But if we let ourselves seize up, we won't be able to take that chance when it comes. If it comes. If Laura's right and someone opens the door, or if you're right and we work out something that helps us somehow." Even more shame flooded Martine, like it hadn't since she was a child, out with her drunk mum, people seeing. Ivy was trying so hard to be kind. "The thought of working up a sweat, though," she said. "I could cry." "I honestly don't think we could smell worse," said Ivy. "If we sweated, it might even push some of the stale sweat off us. Dislodge it, you know, like a Turkish bath." "I suppose we've got flannels now," Martine said. "Better than those slimy wet wipes. More of a scrub." "I want a green pot scourer," Ivy said, "or some wire wool and a pumice stone." "I want a loofah mitt and a bottle of Dove," said Martine. "And an Uzi," said Ivy. "For next time Gail comes down, shoot the lock off the door and then take her kneecaps out." Martine couldn't help laughing and hoped it didn't sound scathing. The chances of Ivy knowing what an Uzi actually was were exactly nil. "You really have changed your tune," she said. "But ricocheting bullets would be a terrible idea down here," Ivy said. "A crossbow would be safer, actually." "Kind of hard to blow out a door lock with it," Martine said. Laura said nothing. "So, a crossbow for Gail's kneecaps and a machete for the door?" said Martine. "And a green pot scourer," Ivy said. Still Laura was silent, and it made the other two wind down into silence too. The rhythm was set for 3. Whether they were laughing or crying, when they were plotting escape and revenge, when they were planning their television appearances, they were a trio. Without Laura, they ran dry. "What's up?" Martine said at last. "The chairs," said Laura. "It never occurred to me till right now." "What about them?" said Martine, "apart from making my teeth squeak." "They can't have had 3 inflatable chairs lying around, can they? Kate must have bought them." "Right," said Ivy, "and she's buying an air bed right now if she was listening yesterday and the gods are smiling." "So why didn't they just bring chairs down from the house?" "Because dead people don't need furniture," said Martine. "I thought it was maybe because they were lighter to carry," Laura went on. "But I don't think so." "I reckon she doesn't want to be seen," Laura said. "Everything she brings into us is in bags, like someone might see her running up and down with our meals or a blanket and get thinking." Martine watched as Laura screwed her face up. "I'm trying to remember what was over the garden walls. I wasn't concentrating. I was thinking about roses and freaking out because I thought I saw a ghost and feeling stupid for getting the day wrong. What's actually there?" "I was unconscious," Ivy said. Martine remembered scuttling away in a crouch, as if there was anywhere to hide in the wooden shelves over the stone floor. Then a blank. "It's just the back of the shops," she said. "Flats, maybe?" "Whatever it is," Laura said, "I reckon someone's watching." "They're not watching very carefully if they didn't see her move your car," Martine said, "or mine." They had agreed that Kate must have shifted the cars round into the old carriage house, or whatever it was, at the end of the long garden. "If they're watching out the back windows," Laura said, "from the flats above the shops, all they would have seen is Kate coming out into the garden through that door after the cars were hidden. But they can see everything that goes on at the kitchen door and the steps and the door into here, can't they? So we can send a sign, and then they'll come." Martine managed not to howl. It wasn't fair to get their hopes up like that and then just say the same old thing. If she could keep it in, Laura could too. "And I know what sign to send," Ivy said. Martine raised her head. If both of them started it, she would lose her mind. "Next time Igor comes in," Ivy went on grimly, "we should keep her. Think about it. If there's a nosy neighbour who watches them come and go, and one day, today, if I've got anything to do with it, Kate comes and doesn't go, well then, what would you do?" "I'd watch and see what Casper did," Laura said. "Exactly," said Ivy. "How long would she hang about before she came in after her? Or would she go away? Even if she did, she'd have to come back. And then we keep her too." "And the nosy neighbour sees that and calls the cops," Laura said. "Exactly. But that's 2 of them against 3 of us," said Martine. "Unless, do you think Kate would come over to our side if she was in here with us?" "No," said Ivy, "but I'm planning to deal with Kate when it's 3 against 1. Does anyone have a problem with that?" Her voice was hard enough to make Martine shiver. "Deal with," she said. "Tie her up," said Ivy. "Think of it that way, if it helps." Martine stared at her. I was joking before, she said, but you have changed. Finally, Ivy said. It took me long enough, and I chickened out once, but yes, I have. Hang on, though, Laura said. If we've got both of them down here with us. No food, said Ivy. I know, so maybe it can't be this afternoon. Maybe we need to do a bit of stockpiling in advance, cut our rations and save some. Would Casper ever come, though? Laura said. Would she get her hands dirty? My turn, thought Martine. They've both had theirs. I don't think that much dependence can all go one way. Oh, great! Dr. Freud's back, said Laura. Sax, Martine said. I wish you would help me remember instead of under my... You're right, Ivy said. Shush, Laura. She's right. We need to send a sign, like you said. And we need to understand them, like she said. And we need to be prepared, like I said, to do what needs to be done. To tie Kate up, Laura offered. Ivy smiled, beamed. Exactly, she said. Tie her up good and tight. Martine wondered how Kate could miss it on Ivy's face later that day when she came in with their food. Airbed, Kate said, putting a black bag on the floor with a thick slapping sound. Just like dead people use, said Laura. And more, Kate said, almost as if she hadn't heard. She had, though, Martine thought. She was shaking her head, slow as a charmed snake. Her new way of pretending they weren't really here. Or she wasn't. Her new way of pretending it wasn't actually happening, this nightmare she had helped into being. Sweatshirts and trousers, she said. Fleece. Laura was closest, and she lunged towards the bag and lifted out a jumble of grey and black clothes, throwing them up in the air as if she was playing in autumn leaves, as if she was turning hay in the sunshine. Hallelujah, she said. As she stood, she grabbed the hem of her dress and pulled it over her head. Standing in her bra and pants, she screwed the dress up in her hands and threw it towards Kate, who stepped aside sharply. You can bin that, she said. Then she plucked a sweatshirt from the pile and pulled it on. She put on a pair of socks, hopping around on one leg and the other, then took a set of bottoms and tied them round her waist like a wrestler's belt. Kate was staring at her. What is it? She said. You seem different. Martine could almost pity her, caught between Gail and them, waiting just as much up there as they were down here. Then Kate turned and shot Martine a look that could shrivel someone much stronger and less exhausted. Martine looked away. There, Kate said. You too. What is it? What do you think it is? Ivy said. She was standing too now, creaking and staggering a bit. Martine thought she was right about the exercise. Ivy was tearing off her cardigan and unbuttoning her blouse. Underneath, she had on a bra, solid and massive, the sort Martine didn't know they made anymore. The flesh of her stomach below it and above her waistband was marshmallow soft and the colour of porridge, with little tags of skin here and there, like pooled stitches in an old jumper. We've got a bed and clean clothes, Ivy said. She was wriggling out of her skirt now, shucking it off and booting it over to where Laura's dress lay, crumpled on the floor. Martine hugged her knees into her chest. They're getting stir-crazy, she said. Kate drilled her with another stare. We all are. You can't be surprised. Why are we in here? Said Ivy. She was standing in sweatshirt and socks too now, like Laura, both of them looking like elves to Martine, their pink flesh like leggings and thick socks like booties. What do you want? What are you going to do with us? Why did you pretend we were your sisters? Why are you keeping us here?" "I'm not keeping you here," Kate said, looking at the wall above their heads. "And I didn't pretend anything." Then she brought her gaze down to their faces. "You should be careful how you speak to me," she said. "Don't you ever wonder why it's always me who comes in?" She was bundling up their discarded clothes in her arms. "You should be grateful." Then, walking backwards, feeling behind her, she made her way to the door. "Why?" Laura said. "Because I think you're dead enough, but you're not dead enough for my sister. And she's almost ready to choose." Ivy moved quicker than Martine dreamed she could. She stood in front of them, with her arms spread wide. "She doesn't need to choose," she said. "She can have me." But the door was already open, and in a moment Kate had locked it behind her again. "Gail!" she shouted. "Let me out!" The key was rattling in the lock before the words had left her mouth. The silence she left behind her lasted a good long while. Laura broke it. "That's not the deal, Ivy," she said. "All for one and one for all." "She means thank you," Martine said. "Me too." "And what got you stripping off and flinging your clobber like we're all on a hen night?" Laura said. "You started it," Ivy said. "But we need to be careful." She picked up on the new mood in here. "We need to try to be the same while we prepare." "And thank God she did," said Martine, "because it rattled her. She let things slip." "Did she?" Laura said. Martine nodded. "I've nearly got it." She put her fingertips against her forehead and balanced her head on them. She could feel the sharp poke of her untrimmed nails on her skin, and it made her feel as if she was forcing her brain to work, pinching it awake. She denied she wanted us in here. She denied that she was keeping us here. "Right," said Laura. "She's just Igor. Gail's the boss, getting ready to choose." And she said she wasn't pretending we were her sisters. We know she didn't prepare for us staying, as if she didn't think beyond getting us here and handing us over for inspection. "Try, Martine," said Laura. Martine ignored the flare of anger at the heel turn and managed not to say, "Make your mind up." "Sisters," she said. "She pretended we were her sisters. It's right on the tip of my—" "Got it!" She had been at the gym, on the rowing machine, entranced by the voice describing something so bizarre and so invisible, the opposite of a normal person standing out like a hippo. It was a normal-looking person, so far departed from reality, it made Martine feel sick. It made her scared to remember the times in her life that she'd seen a random middle-aged black man on a city street and wondered about him. "Capgras syndrome," she said. "It was Oliver Sacks. I think I don't know what it is. An illness? It's a delusion where someone thinks strangers they've never met are people they know. Thinks the people they know have been taken away. This is it. Gail keeps telling Kate not to speak to her, not to feed her, doesn't she? She doesn't believe Kate's her sister anymore. She wants a new one. She's going to choose a new one." "Choose one to kill," said Laura. "Or choose one to keep." "And kill the other two," Ivy said. "And I pushed myself forward. I had no idea. I thought I was protecting you." "Shush," said Martine. "Of course you did. None of us knew." "But how can Kate go along with it, instead of just getting a bloody doctor?" Laura said. Why's she pandering? Ivy found herself answering. When you live a small life, turned in, you can get a long way down a road without ever knowing. Martine heard the break in her voice. Don't upset yourself, she said. And put your feet back up, Laura added. I couldn't see beyond a cat, Ivy wailed. Shh, said Laura, making Martine's flesh crawl at the memory of Gail, sliding about in her bare feet, whispering and shushing. Sorry, Laura said. She'd noticed Martine shuddering. A cat, Ivy said again, with a deep sob in her voice. Don't, Martine said. You are nothing like her. She's not just dependent, Ivy. She's parasitic. She's fused. She's like a twin from a horror film. She's a perversion. You don't know what it's like, Ivy said again. Mother. The things I did because of Mother. I killed a mouse. I let it die in agony. Would you have killed a cat? Said Martine. No. A child? No! And look what you're willing to do for Laura and me. Sacrificing yourself. But Ivy wouldn't be consoled. I thought I was, but I got it wrong. What if I've made it worse? She'd have to try something else, thought Martine. I tell you what, she said, sticking her nose up and pretending to sniff the air. A bit of adrenaline hasn't helped us smell any better. Laura wrinkled her nose, held open the neck of her sweatshirt and poked her face in. It's a complete waste of these clean clothes. No, Ivy said. She said, bolt upright, the sobbing gone. We have got to stop caring about being dirty. It doesn't matter. Laura winked at Martine. It had worked. Ivy was back on the warpath. How long were those miners underground in wherever it was? She said. And astronauts? It doesn't matter. Agreed, said Martine. We exercise and we concentrate on feeling strong and capable. We need to stop giving a toss about anything else. You do, for sure, Laura said. Her face was solemn. Because when we get out and you see your hair, you're going to scream and run straight back in again. Martine's mouth dropped open, and she was silent for a long beat. Then the laughter bubbled up from her belly and burst out of her. The other two joined in, and before long, all three of them were gasping. Upstairs, in the ladies' withdrawing room, Kate stood in the deep shadow at the side of the window and watched her sister's chest rise and fall. I told you, she said. Something's changed. Listen to them. They're laughing. Gail said nothing. You need to... it's up to you, of course, but if I could... I'd say, if you're ready... Shh! Gail breathed, her lips hardly moving. She was propped on the chaise longue, with her net curtain draped over the headrest and covering her to her waist. Let me rest. Please. Shh. Leave me be. 18. I came awake with my limbs flailing and found myself upright in bed, heart hammering and hair sticking to my scalp. I had been back in my parents' house, locked in my room, and my room was a train carriage, rocking, slack and sway-bellied, as if the couplings were loose or the rails were the wrong gauge. Shaking, I reached out and put my bedside lamp on, half expecting to hear the furtive scuffle of someone creeping around my flat, trying to find me. There was only silence, the soft sound of the wind in my drafty windows and the tick of my heating. He wouldn't, would he? And anyway, how could he find me? I'd ditched my car, my phone, and my laptop. I hadn't used my cards. A woman couldn't just disappear. Adeem and the girls would kick up a stink. And anyway, he wouldn't. I tried to forget the way he'd looked at me and spoken to me, scorn turning his voice sour and his face ugly. "Try me," he'd said. "Check out your brownies and guides' ideas about life, Tash. Go on. You need to learn that the world isn't the pink sherbet place you think it is." "You've got a week," I'd said. He'd pushed his lips out and shook his head very slowly from side to side, staring up at me through his brows. I didn't like looking at him when he did that. I stood up and backed off, putting distance between us. I didn't know whether it would be an open-handed slap or a blow from his fist. Maybe it would be both hands round my neck and those small eyes looking coldly into mine until my vision faded. "Don't test me, Dad," I said. "I've got nothing to lose, yet I've done nothing wrong. You're not safe till I've taken over and bleached the books. Then I'll have to keep my mouth shut or face jail time along with you. But right now, you've got nothing on me, so get a clue, and quick." He was rising to his feet. He looked stupid with meanness, small-brained and frightening. He looked like someone who couldn't be reasoned with or even bargained with. He was just a sack of dull meat, angry and bewildered by this new feeling of not getting his way. When I scrabbled my way out the door and slammed it behind me, I expected to hear him fling himself against it like a rabid animal. I expected to hear him pawing and scratching. "All right, Tash," said the manager I passed on the stairs. "You've been a stranger." I ignored him, scurrying past, fast enough to feel my feet slip on the metal edging of the steps. "Okay there, Tash," said the girl on reception. I had spent one Christmas works night out in the women's bogs with that girl and a bottle of tequila, moaning about boyfriends and cracking each other up about maybe just marrying each other because how bad could it be? On watery legs, I clambered out of bed and felt my sweaty feet slide on the carpet tiles my bedroom floor had been covered with, the cheapest available, flat from wear, but still with the odd stiff fibre that could stick to my skin and make me instantly itchy. I dragged my feet to clean them once I got onto the laminate in the hallway, feeling the sprung edges from its cack-handed installation dig into my insteps, not caring. I poured myself a glass of tap in the kitchen, then took it to the back window to look out into the night. Nothing was moving. Not so much as a cat or a fox disturbed the glitter of the garden walls and the grass beyond as the temperature fell and the dew formed. On the long stretch behind the fairy tale cottage, there were footprints on the grass. I could see them in the harsh moon shadow, as if they had been added by an artist to finish off the scene. I looked upwards to the blue-black velvet of the sky and the shimmering disk of moon, one night off full, maybe two, outshining the stars so they only winked instead of dazzling. I was almost glad I'd had the nightmare now. So few clear nights had a moon as bright as this one that let you see colours. Or was it my imagination? I wondered, as I turned my gaze down again, that the grass had a green cast, and that the walls were pearly grey. I leaned my head against the window pane, letting my breath cloud it and clear, cloud it and clear. Then I held it. There was someone down there. Someone was moving in the shadow of the stable wall at the far end of that long, blank garden. I pulled back, but I knew it was too late. If he was looking, he'd have seen me. So, instead of running for my phone or even for my keys and down to my car. I stood still and kept watching. I didn't understand what I was seeing, as the figure broke away from the shadow and moved out onto the grass again, only that it was too simple a shape to be a real person. It fluttered at the edges as it moved, and it had no head or arms. It was just a long column of soft grey flitting up the garden towards the back of the house. I don't believe in ghosts, but I came closer in those few moments than I ever had before. Another minute showed me it was a person after all, a woman wearing something long and shapeless that skimmed the ground, and a veil that covered her to her waist, hiding face and neck, hands and arms. And if I had any lingering doubts, I could see the set of new prints in the grass from flesh and blood feet, and the dull glint of some app or other flashing on and off on the phone she held in her hand. At the house, the figure turned away to open the door in the offshoot, then slipped inside. I could see through the veil then, in the harsh light cast by a bare overhead bulb. Underneath, the woman had long hair hanging down her back, and her veil was actually a net curtain, still with the doubled hem for the curtain rod weighing it down on one side. Was that the same woman who dotted about in her slippers and was forever tidying her cellar, up and down with bags and boxes every day? She seemed taller. Or maybe everyone would look taller, dressed as a grey ghost on a moonlit night. It was none of my business, and I had more to worry about than what my neighbours got up to. Except if I went round and introduced myself to the women, and said I had seen a prowler, that was more folk to agree with the police that I had disappeared. If I disappeared. He wouldn't, would he? I made a huge, grinding effort to stop the thought from replaying. I could drive myself over the edge and end up like that mad bat in her net curtain if I kept going at the same thing like a hamster on a wheel. So, never mind if he would. Could he? I picked up my laptop and climbed back into bed, clicking the light on and looking out at the street lamp glow beyond my window, wondering if I needed to draw the curtains, wondering if anyone else would be up in Hep-Haw at this time of night, and if seeing the top of my headboard and half my wardrobe mirror would matter, even if they were. Then I tucked the blankets in round my knees and typed missing girls. 681 million results. China, Canada, 841 in Africa, 1 in London on Valentine's Day. Missing women, I typed. 897 million hits. I let my head drop back with a soft knock against my headboard and looked up at the dark Artex paint beyond the glow of my bedside lamp. Think, I told myself. You already know more than you ever wanted to about trafficked girls, bonded servants, and modern slavery. What you need to know is how big a deal it would be if you went missing. It came to me as if someone had whispered in my ear. If I wanted to know how likely it was that a woman like me would go missing from where I was, and how big a fuss would get made if I did, I knew exactly what to search for. Missing woman, Hep-Haw, 2018, gave me nothing. I cast my mind back over the year and tried again. Missing woman, Fraserburgh, 2018. Bingo, I whispered to myself. Got one. The Press and Journal had written about the case regularly while it was fresh, and then kept reporting on the search for a while afterwards. I clicked on the first story. Aberdeenshire police are seeking information about 54-year-old Ivy Stone, who has been missing from her Fraserburgh home for 3 weeks. Miss Stone, who works at home as a bookkeeper, lives alone. Her postal carrier raised the alarm after becoming concerned about delivered mail visible through her letterbox. William Mackay, who has been employed on the same mail route for 7 years, spoke to our reporter. "Ivy's not the sort to disappear and leave a mess," he said. "She stops her post whenever she goes a wee trip anywhere. You could set your clock by her. She picks up her parcels, she tips at Christmas, and she hands back anything that's not got her name on it." I knew there was something wrong when I could hear her letters hitting the day before's envelopes instead of hitting her carpet. The CID sergeant in charge of Miss Stone's case, however, had this to say. "Her phone's gone and her laptop's gone. She didn't clean out her fridge, but that's not against the law. She's a low priority, according to Police Scotland's metrics. She's in good health, and there are no signs that she left home anything but voluntarily. We urge Miss Stone to get in touch and reassure us of her well-being, but we are not pursuing the case as suspicious." I read the story over again, thinking, I was dead right to make my routines common knowledge then. But no one had paid any real attention to Ivy in any case, had they? The story ran shorter and shorter, further and further from the front page. There was just one more snippet, so brief I nearly missed it. 2 weeks later, the same reporter had interviewed a committee member from the 9 Lives League. We didn't get her name and address, but she was here at our meeting a week or 2 before they say she went missing. Even though she wasn't a member, she was only here to meet a friend, and I reckon she knew she was leaving town because she wouldn't give us her details. God almighty, I muttered. Stray cats. It probably wasn't fair, but this Ivy in her 50s wasn't really the Fraserburgh equivalent of me, was she? Surely I would leave a bigger hole than that if I suddenly vanished. I cleared the search and cleared out my history too, a habit I'd worked hard to get up and running in the last year. Lockerbie, I typed, missing woman 2018. There were 2 this time. One poor cow who'd run out on her husband and kids when she couldn't take another day of depression and the shit of waiting 3 weeks for an appointment to speak to a knackered practice nurse to get on the waiting list to see a knackered psychiatrist with a twitchy prescription finger. She'd run away to Skye and spent the family's entire capital, not much, in a B&B before the cash ran out and she used her debit card. She was back home now. Even more stressed from lack of money, but bumped up the waiting list for a therapy appointment probably. The other one was more promising. Martine McAllister was 30, a freelance grant writer who lived alone and disappeared from home with her phone and laptop, leaving clients in the lurch. She had set up automatic adverts to run in email newsletters, some of them to the same clients she was letting down, which pissed them off. Understandably. The Dumfries Standard had managed to get a spin on the story off the back of that. Martine's car had pinged an ANPR on the M8 near Livingston, but the reporter took pains to point out that plate recognition doesn't show drivers' faces, and he managed to tie that to the emails. Supposed to be genuine contact, but when they're still landing in your inbox after the person's hooked it and isn't answering the complaints they're getting, it shows how false our online relationships really are, how faceless our society has become. This Martine had never turned up, or not that I could find out anyway. There was a letter to the paper from something called Family Forest, probably some nutty church. "We miss Martine," the letter said. "She was a welcome presence at our meetings, and she had made a new friend that last night she was with us. We have set up a Facebook page, Find Marty, to share all information." Find Marty hit me in the gut like a pile driver. The picture looked blurry and strange, as if Martine had been accidentally in the background of some other shot, and the solemn group, all holding candles that made the header for the page, were the only ones who had ever posted. 7 of them there were. 2 retired couples and a younger pair, along with a man in his 50s who was looking off to the side as if waiting for the photo shoot to be over. I scrolled down a bit until the repeated messages of concern and pleas for information were getting so overfamiliar I couldn't bear it anymore. Some of them were cut and pasted from another page, Martine's name showing up in a different font, where it had been added in. Regular attendee at family forest. Enthusiastic forester. Great loss of expertise. Expertise? Maybe Martine was in the choir or arranged the flowers. Except the background to the 7 po-faced members with the candles looked more like a pub function room. I scrolled back to the top and studied the woman's face again. She was solemn, but eager-looking, well-polished with shiny hair held back in a clip at the nape of her neck and a small gold ring in the ear I could see. She was surely sitting in that same function room with its loud patterned curtains and tasselled lampshades on the wall sconces, and she was sitting forward in her chair, as if whoever she was talking to was holding her wrapped. Maybe that person would have more to say about Martine than that she was a regular attendee and a welcome presence. Maybe that person, holding her attention like a magician at a kid's birthday party, would have photos of Martine that were posed with her own sweet face in the middle of the frame. Or maybe this was the last night, and the interesting person was the new friend. Maybe Martine was just dead polite and pretending to be fascinated by some bore. Things go in threes, I told myself, clearing the search again and punching in a new one. Missing Woman, Air, 2018. Maybe because it was the seaside, the kind of place people ran away to, with plenty cheap B&Bs, empty in the off-season. There were 4 this time. One of the missing women in Air wasn't a woman. She was a girl of 17. And I felt a bitter hit of adrenaline as I read through the newspaper reports. This was different. The Record and the Herald both cared about this one, and Police Scotland categorised her differently too. 17 years old meant a dedicated search and a team. She turned up. The report was bold, but between the lines, I thought there was a man involved. I'd have put a wedge on the teacher in his 40s who appeared days later in Ayr Sheriff Court, charged with unlawful detention of a minor. 2 more were a pair of widows who had walked away from a pyramid scheme and made it to Spain. I half remembered the story. Gilt-edged grands was the Ayr paper's headline. The last of the 4 women was something else again. She was a professional running her own business. I read and reread the descriptions of it, but couldn't work out what the business was exactly. There were a lot of businesses like that these days. This woman, Laura Wade, had disappeared from Ayr while I was still working there. She had gone out one Saturday in May, all dressed up for a date, and had never come home. I read the address with a strange prickling feeling up the back of my neck. Surely that was where Siobhan, one of my old patients, lived. I had probably been right there at those flats a dozen times picking her up and dropping her off. It was a horrible thought that a woman had been abducted right from that very spot. I kept reading. Laura Wade hadn't been abducted from her flat, in fact. The woman's car was missing, which at first had seemed like a sign that she'd gone somewhere voluntarily, but then it never turned up. It wasn't illegally parked, racking up fines, and it hadn't been clocked at a port taking her through the tunnel to France. It had been tracked up the M77 to Glasgow and onto the M8. Then it had vanished, along with its owner. I scrolled some more and found another follow-up story. The police were inclined to think Laura Wade had done a runner because her phone and laptop were both gone. But I was beginning to lose faith in that as shorthand for all being well. Hadn't the other 2 women, in Fraserburgh and Lockerbie, both taken their phones and laptops with them too? I shook my head, feeling muzzy, and glanced at the time in the corner of my screen. It was getting on for 3 o'clock now. I sank back against the headboard, wishing I hadn't looked at any of this, because there was no denying it now. Whether or not he would, he certainly could. Women disappeared from towns all over Scotland every month, and no one ever found them. No one even tried to. So I would get up in the morning and go to the police. I'd tell them everything. I'd say my dad was filthy, and the only way to prove it now he'd got out and covered his tracks behind him was to put a forensic accountant into BG, which would tank it. Egger would lose his job and his pension, and the manager and receptionist I'd scuttled past the other day. Every last one of them. And all that filthy money would pay for a great lawyer, and Gary and Lynn and Baz would all get off. Then I would disappear anyway. If he meant it. If he would really do it. If. I scrolled back to the top of the page and was just about to delete everything when the picture of Laura Wade in the news story snagged my attention. It was a security cam still, taken overhead, showing the woman letting herself out of the door of a block of flats. I stared at it. Then I moved the mouse, watching the cursor jig around in obedience to the way my hand was shaking. Images. The news disappeared to be replaced by a chessboard all over the screen and disappearing off it at the bottom. A Warhol print of that same overhead security camera shot over and over again. A woman in a floating summer dress, peach-coloured with cream ruffles, letting herself out of a glass door with a bulky compression hinge. And reflected in the open door, I could see part of a bumper and half a number plate, a pair of thin legs in corduroy standing at the curb between the car park and the walkway. That was Siobhan's husband, Kenneth, in the cords. And that bumper and number plate was my ambulance, my patient transporter. I had seen the woman. I had seen Laura Wade leaving her flat. Siobhan had said how nice she looked, and the men had made some daft jokes about romance and love. Something like that anyway. I couldn't remember the details. But I remembered the dress. Peaches and cream and ruffled like something for a summer wedding. I had seen Laura Wade on the last day.